Treat him good.
How about it? English? You got sound?
I have no idea.
Well, we'll try to play. That's the one we're starting with.
I don't know.
Last week we talked about context. So I wanted to share a couple of things with you about context, the importance of it. The story is told of an Italian explorer that went east, Vatican. What about the sounds? This potentate,
Right, he's got the phone. But you want to try giving this one? See if this will work better?
If you can answer 3 questions, then I will let you fix it. On your way. And explore some 3 questions.
No idea.
And well, it might be more difficult than you think. And that is because I'm not going to ask them with words, and you're not going to answer them with words. And
That's better.
hear about that, and said, okay, well, we'll give it a try. So the potentate start. First question. Potentate.
I don't know what to do.
And the potentate went. And the store the potentate said, you can correctly. Please go on your way. You're welcome, my friend, whatever you need. As they left the place, the potentate's advisors asked, we don't know what went on. Tell us what went on. And he said, okay, I'll tell you. I told him there's one God. And he said, no, there are 2 gods, Allah and you will be the And I said, the world is round. And he said, yes, it is. It's on its axis. And I said, the oceans are deep. The oceans are wide. Very deep. The oceans are very deep.
I don't know what to do about this.
Okay. But the same
I
thing
don't know what to do about that.
with the explorer. He just entourage left.
I mean, it's not a Wi-Fi issue. It's a connection issue.
This night.
No, don't do that. It's a connection in the microphone.
Replace this microphone.
Yeah, it's a hardware problem. But this is the only microphone I had, and I don't know if it works.
Suffering. Cheese. And off with his head. I said, before you with that. So, context. Context also involves gestures. But I didn't mention this last week, but gestures is important. Now, we're all familiar with a very prominent gesture that we see when driving. But I mean other gestures. We learned in Greece, for example, that you don't wave like this. Because when you wave like this in Greece, you just put a spell on someone. What you do to wave is you wave like this. There are other things that you have to be aware of, especially in foreign countries. But also in this country, in select areas, there are contextual issues that you may not be aware of. Let me give you a little context. As far as I know, I am not heir to the Butterworth fortune.
I mean,
Yeah, that's what I said too. Even though my wife is Mrs. Butterworth, and so are my 2 daughters. But that's beside the point. I grew up in a Christian church out of California. Please forgive me for that. I was born and raised in California much before it was what it is today. My grandfather was a minister in the Christian church. Most of his ministries were Mississippi West, but I believe he was also in Huntsville. My father was not in the ministry, but he was in the church and on the church boards and so forth like that. My wife is a preacher's kid. Her father was a Christian church minister. Missouri, grew up and raised in Missouri and then California. And he raised her right so that she could raise me right. We've been married 52 years this year. And I've been in the active ministry 52 years. That makes it easy for me to remember.
It's the mic.
There's
Something
noises.
wrong with the mic.
Ministry in Portland, Oregon area, in Los Angeles area, in New Mexico, where we spent most of our time, 30 years in New Mexico, and also in that. We have spent up until 3 years ago, for 10 years, after we, retired. While we were in Mexico, we both worked at the National Laboratory also for 17 years. She was in the physics department. I was in the nuclear physics department, nuclear materials. So if you turn out the lights, I'll probably blow it. But, you know, it's alpha radiation, so your skin will protect you. It doesn't matter. After that time, in ministry at the same time, and also taught 17 years in a Bible college in Albuquerque, New Mexico. After all that time, we retired in 2010, and we went on the road, lived in a 40-foot coach for 10 years, full time, between Arizona to Mexico, but also back here, because we have the same in Fort Lauderdale. We have another son in San Antonio. We now have changed our ministry a little bit to helping churches like I'm helping you.
Now it seems to be better,
But he's not on.
it's not enough.
He's not on, so I mean, it's.
Most of my ministry was in small
I
churches.
just leave it
And I
here.
know small churches
See if over here, as soon as you
have a problem because
go on the first pew right here, you can hear the noise louder.
Yeah. So we're just going to leave it.
And maybe a men's Bible study, and maybe a women's Bible study, and all that. And we need to figure it out. So if I can be of some help to help a minister in a smaller congregation, for whether that's going, then that's what I see my ministry as. Okay, now reset, Eva.
I hope so.
Okay, we'll give it a try. Tonight we're going to talk about the question. So turn to Matthew, the 24th chapter. Matthew 24. And we're going to look at the first few verses, at least starting with the first few verses. We'll also be looking at Mark and Luke's gospel for the same account, but we'll look at that later. In Matthew's account, chapter 24, 23rd chapter, as we said last week, Jesus has condemned the Pharisees, has laid it on them hard, called them hypocrites, vipers, snakes, whitewashed tombs, all sorts of names to help them get the idea that they're missing something that God has tried to help them see over the centuries in the Old Testament. Now we come to the 24th chapter. Jesus comes out from the temple, followed by his disciples. He's going away from them. He points to the buildings. The disciples point to him, the buildings. And he says to them, do you not see these things? Now the buildings would be the temple structure mainly, and then the porticos around them. And he says, don't you see this? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Now, Mark and Luke's accounts have the same idea expressed. Not one stone will stand upon another. And so their natural reaction is to ask the question that we see here. He's sitting on the Mount of Olives. They come to him, verse 3, and he says, they say to him, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now there's some confusion here on the part of the disciples. Jesus promised, that's your first blank, take your notes on page 2 of the start. Jesus promised the desolation for Jerusalem. And the disciples respond by showing these great stones, that's another blank, as proof of the permanence of Jerusalem. And they're kind of challenging Jesus and saying to him, how can what you say be true when this fantastic temple is there? Now, the belief at the time, we have to understand this context. The belief at the time was that the temple would be the center of worship during the Messianic age, and it would last forever. So your blanks under A number 2, temple and Messianic and forever. Now the prediction that Jesus makes here in this verse, verse 3, is fulfilled in 70 AD by Titus and the Roman armies. And so thoroughly was that done that Josephus tells us there was left nothing to make those who came there believe it had ever been inhabited. That's pretty significant. Even some ancient cities like Persepolis and Babylon have rooms that let people know there was somebody who lived there. But Josephus tells us the city of Jerusalem was so flattened that people even questioned whether others could live there or not. That happened in 70 AD. Now we're going to refer to Josephus, and if you don't know who Josephus is a Jew who lived at the time of 70 AD. He was an older Jew at the time. It's possible that he was alive early in his life when Jesus was crucified, although that hasn't been confirmed as far as I know. But Josephus, he was on the outside of Jerusalem in 70 AD. He was encamped with the Roman armies, but he also could go into the city, and he gives us an account of both what's happening outside the city and what's happening inside the city. Yes?
I just wanted to bring up a small thing that I remember. Was that at some point the Roman armies torched Jerusalem.
Exactly.
And the flames caused the gold that was in the temple to melt. And they wanted to recover. So in order to do that, they had to remove every single stone.
Exactly. Right. Now he's been reading it. That's exactly right. That's what happened. Josephus tells us that in fact. So Josephus, back to him, he's on the inside and the outside. He's seen both sides of this 70 AD escapade and assault. So he's pretty active. He's written about it in a book. He has a massive book, and it's about 2 inches thick, very small, probably I'd say about a 6 or 8 point type font, and he's got over 200 pages, just double column, 200 pages just on the 70 AD assault of Jerusalem. So he really fills in the blanks for us. Number 3 under letter A, when the disciples heard of the coming judgment day, that's what Jesus tells them is coming. They naturally thought the judgment and the eternal Messianic age were synonymous. Now, what Jesus is going to do is he's going to correct them. So the disciples ask one question. And again, what is that question? When is this going to happen, and what's the sign of the time, the indicator of when the end comes? Their question is also found in Mark 13 and Luke 21. And if you compare those three texts, the disciples are asking for the time of these things and the sign of the time. So they're asking only one question. In their mind, in their understanding of all their years of listening and reading the Old Testament and listening to the teaching of the rabbis about the Messianic age, their whole thinking is that when Messiah comes, he will introduce the golden age of Israel. Israel will be the leader of the world. The Messiah will be the king of the world. And that will be the last age that is ever going to happen. That will be eternity. So they're looking and they're thinking context that when Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, that's how they're thinking. How could Jerusalem be destroyed and yet Israel be the leader of the world and the Messiah sit on the throne of Jerusalem and the temple as the center of that worship and of the world? It didn't make sense because their context was Messiah would conquer everything and be king of the world. And Jesus is telling them that's not the case. The temple is going to be destroyed. The religion is going to be correct. You're going to be destroyed and dispersed. And the city of Israel, Jerusalem, is going to be destroyed. So only one question is asked concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. But Jesus answers the real question, and it concerns two separate events. And those events are separated by time. They're not synonymous. So what he does is he first speaks of the when and the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem. Those are verses 4 through 35 of chapter 24. And then starting with verse 36 of chapter 24 on to the end of chapter 25, then he talks about the when and the sign of the end of the world at his second coming. So look at page 9. There's a chart on page 9 that we're going to throw into. Looks like this. We're going to look at three aspects of what Jesus is going to say in these two chapters. Now, if you remember, last week I said the 34th verse of chapter 24 is the key verse. It reduplicates and it copies the 36th verse of chapter 23. They both say all of this will come upon this generation. And they act like bookends. And everything between is what he says is going to come on that generation. And that material is what you mostly hear when people today are talking about the signs of the times. They're taking material from the 24th chapter between those two bookends, and they're saying that applies to the end of the world. My argument is it doesn't apply to the coming of Jesus, it applies to the destruction of Jerusalem. Because he says at both ends of it, all of this will come on this generation. So let's look at this. It's split up this way, I think. Notice Matthew 24, 3 through 35 is a judgment on Israel. And then 36, on through the end of chapter 25, is the judgment on the world. Now, why do we think that's the case? Why do I think that's the case? There are some differences. First one is vocabulary. In the judgment on Israel, he uses those days. He uses it a number of times. Those days. And I specifically point out to you the plural of days. That's going to be important. He also talks about the sun, the moon, and the stars, and other events like that, including those would be false Christs, earthquakes, pestilence, wars, rumors of wars. Those things that we hear all the time on the news or in Christian circles are signs of the coming of the world, or the coming of the end of the world, or the rapture, or whatever it might be. Okay, but I think Jesus is saying, no, those don't apply that. That's not signs. Those are things that go to the destruction and punishment of Israel. He also uses prophetic language and apocalyptic language. Now, what's the difference? Prophetic would be where he says something like, there's going to be a man who comes and kills the king. A classic example would be where Isaiah tells the Israelites that a virgin will conceive and bear a child. See, that's prophetic, and you understand, because we all know what a virgin is, we all know what a child is, we all know what conception is. But apocalyptic language is prophetic language that is couched in terms that we don't quite understand what it is. And that's your sun, moon, and stars. What does it mean when the sun is turned to blood, and the sun goes out, and the moon is turned to blood, and the stars fall from the sky? See, if that's strictly prophetic language, then it's going to literally happen. But if it's apocalyptic language, it will happen, but it won't literally happen. It stands for something else. It's a symbol for something else. Okay, understand? What is it a symbol of? We'll talk about that when we get to those verses. Very important. Okay? Now, the signs. What are the signs? Jesus tells his disciples what the sign is to look for. In fact, he says, don't look for anything but this one sign. And he says, when you see the abomination that makes desolate, flee to Judea. He doesn't say that about the false Christ. He doesn't say that about pestilence, wars, and rumors of wars. He doesn't say that about earthquakes and famine. He doesn't say that about the sun, the moon, and the stars. He says only one thing is a sign. And that is when you see the abomination that makes desolate, flee to Judea. Flee from the city. That is the sign of the coming destruction on Jerusalem. And in fact, I'll give you a little pointer. Josephus tells us that the Christians in the city saw that sign, and they all got out. And according to Josephus, not one Christian lost his life in the destruction of Jerusalem. Why? Because they saw the sign, they got out. They knew what the sign was. They knew what it meant. Now we're going to talk more about that sign, because that sign doesn't mean much to us, does it? Us being Gentiles, we don't know what the abomination that makes desolate is. That's right out of the book of Daniel. We'll look at that later. But we'll look at something here in a little while that will show what it is. The time, I've said it a couple times, within a generation down the line. Those are those bookends. Chapter 23, verse 36. Chapter 24, verse 34. All this will come on this generation. judgment of the world. We got to change. Now, one of the things that I think people have missed is that when people talk about two different subjects, and that's what we have here, two different subjects. Destruction of Jerusalem, destruction and return of the Lord, destruction of the world. When they talk about two different things, people are prone to make sure that their listeners or their readers understand which one of those two they're talking about. So in other words, if some of this passage that we're looking at here on this left-hand column, if some of that passage has to do with 70 AD, and some of it has to do with the destruction of the world and the coming of Jesus and the rapture and everything else connected with that, don't you think that Jesus would make a point of saying, now we're talking about this, now we're talking about that, now we're talking about this, now we're talking about that? But he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that at all until verse 36. In verse 36, he makes a change. And he says, now. Now, it's a small word in Greek, but it's an important change in the argument. Because the whole situation changes in that right column. Notice what changes now with verse 36 and following. It's no longer those days. It is now that day. Vocabulary has changed. He's changed subjects. That day, in the mind of the apostles, who know very well all of the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Amos, all the minor prophets, major and minor, and know them quite well, they know that when that day is referred to, it means the coming of the Messiah. Now, they don't understand at this point that he's talking about his second coming. That's something we understand in hindsight. They only understand about him coming to set up his kingdom, because that day is when he's going to do that. Okay? Follow me so far? All right. There's another change. There's no sun, moon, and stars. Not one mention of it in verses 36 and following. Significant change in vocabulary. And if those are signs that point to the coming of the Lord, then why doesn't he include it? Because I think they're not signs of the coming of the Lord. And third, now there's no prophecy anymore, or apocalyptic language. It's all parables, except for the Noah story. That one is right out of the Old Testament, but in his parables. And that's what he uses to illustrate his return. The parables. We'll talk about more of that later. What are the signs? What do you think the sign is? He says, there's no sign. Any of you ever been robbed? Had a house break-in? Did the thief phone you and tell you he was coming? Didn't do it. I know personally he didn't do that. That's how it will be when Jesus returns. There'll be no sign. And finally, the time, we don't know. Jesus himself doesn't even know. He said, I don't know. Only the Father knows. Only the Father knows. Now, in homiletics, which is a class about preaching, they tell you, do three things. Tell your audience where you're going. Tell your audience when you're there. And tell your audience where you've been. I just tell you where we're going. So now, I'm going to share with you where we are and how we do it. passage. So let's look at it. We've looked at the setup. Let's look at his first answer. Remember that first answer has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. When is the temple going to be flattened? When is that going to happen? And what is this thing we look for that tells us that will happen soon? Okay? So, verse 4 and following. Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumor of wars, but see that you are not frightened, for these things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. In various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all of these things are going to begin to the good things. Now I believe it's marked as the idea of Father will be raising a rebellion against the Son, and the Son will rebel against the Father, and those kinds of things besides what's written now. We get a good picture. But Jesus starts by saying, don't be led astray. What could lead them astray? What could make them think that the destruction of the temple is almost here? Well, one of the things he mentions is false Christ. The disciples, he says, should not expect his coming, here's your blank, at the destruction, nor be deceived by people who claim to be Christ. Now this goes back to Jeremiah. In Jeremiah, the false prophets and even the priests were saying over and over to the people, while Babylon was mounting its forces and getting ready to besiege the city, these priests and false prophets and so forth were saying to the people, hey, everything's okay. It's hunky-dory. I think that's a Hebrew term. And it's okay. You see, that temple over there, that temple is going to stand forever. And as long as it stands, nothing's going to touch us because God will protect us. That's what they were told. They were taught that by their religious leaders who ought to know. So they believed it. But guess what? Babylon didn't know that's the way it was supposed to be. And they took the city, and they flattened the temple, and they took the people off. Not a good the temple did them, huh? But see, that's in their mind. That's part of their context, their understanding. They're thinking that as long as that temple is there, they're okay. And that if the temple is besieged, the Messiah is going to rush in and ride in on his white horse like that night and save them from destruction. And Jesus says, ain't gonna happen. Remember what he told the Jewish leaders in chapter 23? This generation, you, he said, have filled up the cup of God's wrath. And what happens when it's filled up? It overflows. That's the cup of God's wrath overflowing. And he said, you are filling it up. And you will not only kill his son, but you will kill the son's messengers, and that will put it over the brink. So, don't expect the Christ to save you and to save you, because you're filling up the cup of God's wrath. Number 2 under A, the destruction will not fulfill such passages as Zechariah 14, which ends well for Jerusalem, but really fulfills Daniel, which ends in destruction for Jerusalem. Number 3, his second coming would not occur during the destruction of Jerusalem. He wants to make that clear to them. See, they're thinking that the second coming would come and therefore the city would be spared and saved. But he's telling them, no, they're two separate events. They're not going to happen at the same time. So, what does that leave us? Well, we see that these events are not signs of the second coming. And the second coming is not during this destruction of Jerusalem. And this is all that Jesus says about the second coming in these 34 verses. It's not going to be when the destruction happens, and these are the signs. Yeah? Yeah. You know, I caught that today. I don't have it. Oh, no. I'm sorry. I'll try to find it. I think it refers to the Daniel passage of the 70 weeks that we're going to look at later, which is like now, Matthew and Mark, in this little passage, with this statement about the beginning of birth pains. The beginning of birth pains is how Matthew says it in verse 8, and Mark occurs with that. Luke tells us the end will not come right away. Now, the word for birth pains doesn't strictly mean only birth pains. It means any kind of anguish. And it may be associated, and sometimes is, with birth, but applies mostly to, and originally to, the anguish of heavy labor, mostly by prisoners breaking rocks. How anguishing that is, and how painful that is. Now, Luke tells us the end will not come right away, and he uses a word which usually is translated straightway or immediately. He uses it a lot. It's translated immediately, and it usually means immediately. There's nothing in the context that doesn't say otherwise. So, how does this relate to birth pains? What happens when a woman is pregnant? There are heightened senses. There's a cessation of certain cycles. There are body bulges. There's morning sickness. But there are other things, but those are not signs of imminent birth, are they? The one sign of imminent birth is what? The water breaking and the labor pains. Then she knows the birth is about to come. And so what he's saying here, and he's not just saying it about the false Christ, but he's going to say it, the same thing applies to the infants and the wars and so forth. What he's saying is that these do not point to the time and the event is going to happen. It only tells us life is going on as normal. Think about it. All of these things that he cites, and we'll see more of them coming up, all of these things he cites are going on all the time. We got a war right now in Ukraine. We got another threatened war with China and Taiwan. We've got Iran, we've got North Korea, we've got all sorts of drug problems, we've got pestilence around the world with COVID-19, we've got drought, we've got all of these things, and they're always happening. If they're a sign that points to something, how can it be always happening? What kind of a sign is that? A sign is supposed to be something that is unusual and outstanding enough to call attention to it and say, this is rare. But all these things are happening all the time. They can't be signs, can they? Because they don't point to anything in the world. But this is usual. So the only thing that Jesus says about the time of his second coming in this discourse at this point, up through verse 34, is that it would occur when not expected and that was not going to happen during the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, you with me so far? Anybody need some blanks to fill in? All right, let's look at another part of the answer. What's happening in the world? World events. Well, the first one are false Christs. Josephus tells us about the time of fears, which is found in Acts the 24th chapter. He says this, now, as for the affairs of the Jews, they grew worse and worse continually, for the country was again filled with robbers and impostors who deluded the multitude. Yet did Felix catch and put to death many of those impostors every day, together with the robbers. Now these impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness and pretended that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God. A couple names: Josephus, son of Magus. You might remember that one. You recognize that one from Acts the 8th chapter. He's the one who was converted, supposedly, and they asked Peter, "Hey, give me the Spirit, the Holy Spirit power, because I can use it." He was one of those disciples by Josephus. A guy named Judas, and a guy named Judas, who was found in Acts the 7th chapter, and another one, Bartichai. Those were all false Christs at the time. And there are probably others. But those were all false Christs. And Jesus is saying, "Go do that forever." It's not me. There were rumors of wars and wars. During Jesus' day, the Roman Empire was in relative peace. But soon after his death, trouble began. 4 Roman emperors, Nero, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, all were assassinated within a year and a half. Turmoil and bloodshed followed. It is to the Jewish nation particularly that this prophecy was beginning. It's the beginning of travail, remember, for them, ending in the destruction of Jerusalem. Josephus tells us that Caligula ordered his statue to be set up in the temple of Jerusalem, and that the Jews refused to allow this, and they lived in terror that he would make war against them. The Jews were threatened by war in turn by Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. There were rumors of wars because of Argaris, and then Vologeses, and declaring but not carrying out war against the Jews. Vitellius, governor of Syria, declared war against the Arabian king Retus, also led to the rumors of war. The Jewish nation went through, at this time, this 40-year period between the death of Jesus and 70 AD, it went through turbulence and attack. In Seleucia, 50,000 Jews were killed. In Caesarea, 20,000 were killed in the battle between Syrians and Jews. And in Alexandria, in Egypt, there was an uprising. Even the title of Josephus' book is clear indication of the turbulent times. He called it the Wars of the Jews. That's what he called it. Going on, world events, famines and pestilence. Acts 11:28 says, "And there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be a great famine over all the world, which came to pass in the days of Christ." Now the whole of this region appears to have been in scarcity of food. The 9th year of his reign was particularly bad. At least 3 other famines occurred during that 40-year period. Then there were earthquakes. Verse 7. There was a great earthquake in AD 46. There was a great earthquake in Rome on the day that Nero became emperor. That should have told us something, I think. There was another one at Apamea in Phrygia. There was another at Laodicea in Phrygia in 60 AD. There was one in Antonia in 62. Seneca, a Roman historian, mentions a great number of them with great damage. Asia, Achaia, Syria, Macedonia, Cyprus, and Paphos. Tacitus, another historian at the time before 70 AD, mentioned several in Crete, several in Italy, one in Rome, another in Campania, in Phrygia, in Apamea, in Laodicea, and Josephus himself tells us of one in Judea. Earthquakes. But Jesus is saying, don't be misled. None of those are signs. Why? Because they're going on all the time. How can it be a sign if it's always happening? It doesn't plug in anything, except that the world is a fallen giver and needs to be a sign. What's happening with the local and church events, the local being Israel? There's persecution. In Acts the 4th chapter, Peter and John are put into prison. And again in Acts 5, Paul in Acts 16, Acts 18, Acts 23, Peter, Paul, James the elder, and James the younger were martyred before Jerusalem fell in the 70th AD. Tacitus, again, Roman historian, tells us that Christians were, as quote, a class of men hated on account of their crimes, end quote. What were their crimes? They did not bow down to Caesar. They bowed down to God. He also tells about apostasy and spiritual coldness. Paul writes in 2 Timothy 1:15, "This you know, that all that are in Asia turned away from you, whom are Artemis and Hermogenes." In 2 Timothy 4:10, he says, "For Venus forsook me, having loved this present world." And verse 16 of that chapter, "At my first offense known to my heart, but all forsook me. They have not related to their account." That's the reason also for the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was important because it laid out how God chose Jesus and put Jesus in superiority to everything that was Jewish. The temple, Moses, the high priest, the sacrifices, everything. Jesus was superior to them all. Why would you want to leave Jesus and go back to that which would not accomplish what Jesus did? Why would you want to leave your Rolls Royce and go back to a U-boat? You remember the U-boat? What happens when that happens? There were also false Christs. We already saw that, false prophets. Acts 20:29. Paul says to the elders at Ephesus, he says, "Know that after my departing, grievous wolves shall eat at you and not sparing the flock." In the 2 Corinthians 11, he says, "For such men are faith apostles of Christ." And the 2 Peter that's his thought, "But there will false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in animal purposes." And in 1 John 4, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are going out in the world." And that's one of the leading reasons for the corruption that's going on. Because at the very beginning, he talks about there's another gospel. There's a gospel that says you have to work through this out. Don't believe it. It's not true. What else is happening with the church? There's a call to endure to the end. Now, this doesn't refer to the end of time, but the end of Jerusalem's time. The context immediately following this verse speaks, this is verse 13 of chapter 24, speaks of the details of how early Christians are to escape from the destruction of Jerusalem. In that 15th verse, which is 2 verses later, he clearly says, "When you see the abomination that causes desolation, get out of the city." And in 14, he makes an interesting statement. He says, "The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." Now you can ask, well, how is it possible to understand the preaching of the gospel in all the world unto all the nations before 70 AD? Good question. Let's go on. We will. The phrase does not indicate that they would become Christians. It only says that they would hear the gospel message. It would be given to them. It would be preached, and an opportunity would be presented for them to believe. On Pentecost, when the gospel was first proclaimed in Romans 1:8 says it this way, first proclaimed throughout the whole world. Remember what was happening at the day of Pentecost? People, it was said in Acts, Luke told us that people from every nation under the sun, I don't think that's the word he said, but he said that all nations were there and they heard the gospel. Romans really said. Colossians 1:6 says, this which is come unto you, even as it is in all the world bearing fruit and increasing. And in verse 23 of that chapter, if so be that you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which you heard, which was preached in all creation under heaven. The history of the Christian church, a book made by a man named Hill, tells of the traditional labors of the apostles. It indicates that the spread of the gospel from Russia to India, Egypt to Britain, Persia to the Atlantic coast, all happened in those early years of the ministration. Now, the language of Jesus, Luke and Paul, of course, is to be understood in the context. What is that context of the world? Does it include Japan and China or Africa? Northern Africa, yes. Southern Europe, yes. Middle East, yes. But not the Americas or the Far East. Why? Because that wasn't their world. Rome was their world. The Roman Empire was their world. The Mediterranean was their world. And that's how we can explain that the whole world heard. It wasn't everybody in the world. It was their world. You have to understand what their thing is. Okay, any questions so far? We started at 7. We'll end at 8. What? I got one here. Any questions? Following me so far? Very good. Let's pray. Father, thanks for your word. You don't understand all of it. You probably not meant to understand all of it. But that's where our faith comes in. We can believe what you told us, even though we may not know exactly what you said. But we do know one thing. And all that we're looking at tonight and in the future is we know 100%